Okay, so here we are back in Sublime, and what we'll be doing now is we'll take a look at the file that we have here and try and make something that's a little bit more useful than just a print hello statement. So what I'll be talking about now is something called definitions, and we're going to do something called a module. So the first thing I'm going to do right now is just create a new file. You can see I immediately get a new file here, and I'm going to say space down a little, we're going to say diff, and that's what we call a definition, right? And now we have to start writing what it is that we want to do. We want to make a module, and we want to make a mod. I'm always going to initialize with my own initials. I'm going to define that it's a module, and I'm going to make a control, and we put parentheses around that, and then we press a colon, and then we tap into it and we press pass, or we can actually say print, and then we say parentheses and we say I am inside the module, and end of our quotation. So if I hit Control Shift S now to save and give it a name, I'm gonna call this is called exactly what we can call it control, or module control .py. Actually, let's call it the same as the KL module control.py, and we're gonna save that. And you can see like how it starts to color grade for me. So the first thing we want to do is figure out how we can call this script. So we know from our intro file that we can definitely call our intro file, but that will only call this line because it's basically just lying in our script in an open area. And as soon as we create a definition, we're actually putting stuff into this bracket on its own. So the definition will be something that we'll have to access once we're inside the file, and I'll show you how to do that now, and I'll show you how it works. So if I now go into my Maya, and we can see here we already sourced our if you keep on writing these things for now, so just make sure you still have sourced this directory here, and we clear out our history, and we don't need to import our intro file anymore. But another thing we want to do now is we have imported our directory, so let's just create another tab that we can work in. So in this case we want to import, and since we already imported our directory, we can go into, let's see here, not this, but let's go to our Sublime and figure out what's it called. So it's called KL module control. So if I go in here and say import that as, or we can say, so that's actually a good notice here. So you can see as soon as I write something in here, and Maya already have a definition, or in this case it'll be a mail command that's called control. So we can't really call it that, or we're gonna override, or we're gonna mess up between that. So let's just call it something else. So ctrl. So right now I imported the file as we saw before. So sorry, I'm a little bit, I want to tap back and forth. So if I do like this now, so right now I can go to my module, right? So right now I just imported my file, but if I do this now, you can see nothing actually happens. I'm not printing anything because I'm still not inside of this definition. So what we need to do now is actually say we want to go inside the file, which we did here. So that's s ctrl, and now we want to go into ctrl, and under ctrl we want to access this definition. So if I say access that definition, sorry, and put parentheses at the end, go like this. Oh, I'm inside the module. Great. So we're actually, that means that now the first thing we did was access the file. So this can be a little bit confusing because I called my definition the same thing as my file, but I'm sure you guys can get your head around it. So just keep in mind that if I go here, if you go inside the script editor and you give it a square or a hashtag, you can write notes, and this line of code will basically not be written by Python. So if I say importing my, let's see here, importing my file, inside my file I open my diff. Great. And it's important that you import, that you know that you import your file, and then you access that file that we renamed to ctrl. So we import the file here, import the file, and then we imported it as a name, so that file is defined by control now. and then we go into control file, and in the control file we're gonna access the KL module control. So we're just gonna do something simple. So let's try and inside of Maya here just create something very simple. So if we say create NURBS, let's try circle. So you can see we get this mel command here, and on its own a mel command is not worth anything inside the Python tab. It's gonna throw us a lot of errors. It's gonna tell you that our syntax is not correct, and obviously we need to do some things here. So but I can still get a lot of stuff out of this. I can still read it. So the next thing we do here is I want to say, okay, so now I want to start working with the Python, like actual Python modules. So in order to do that, we have to import the Python module. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm importing, and this is why I waited with this line, because I know that this is what you learn anywhere, and this is the first line you'll see. But I kind of wanted you guys to understand that we actually import a file first, and it's exactly the same thing we're doing here. We imported the Maya commands as commands, so we're importing whatever that module is inside of this, and that means that all the mel commands that are already stored in Maya has now been imported, and they're already accessible now that I've run this. So if I hit enter, I'm importing the Maya commands and I'm importing the X commands. I could have imported them as CM or CMD or whatever, it doesn't matter, but I like to call it CMDS. So let's import it as Maya commands. And if I now go down here and I say, okay, so I know that the mel command is circle. So let's see if I'm assuming that that's probably still the same inside the Python module. So if I say commands dot circle and just always finish a definition, because we're accessing a circle is basically a definition, right? Let's try and delete this one and just run this command here. Alright, so we actually got something. So what we saw here is that after we threw our command, we actually had a result thrown back to us. And this is what we call return values. So every time, or almost in all Maya commands that are basically creating something, you will get something called a return value or a result. So right now I'm getting two things here, and if I take this one down here, and we can just write returns, just paste it here. So let's see, what are we going to return? Well, first two things that we need to notice. If I tap this one down, you get a U here. That's not so necessary. I want to come back to that, so just forget about that. You can leave it but I want to come back to that. So if we just do like this, first things first, we have these brackets, and they're not parentheses, they're brackets, and it's important to understand that there's a difference inside of Python. Brackets means that it's a list of objects. So in this case, if I write list and equal to open and close bracket, I'll basically have an empty list, right? There's nothing inside of these brackets. But if I move this one down here and delete these two here and call it list, now if I define my list as these two things. So if I right now double click on list, so how I just select one line is I triple click on a line, so 1, 2, 3, and if I go 2 times, I select a word, and 1 time is obviously just placing your cursor or whatever you say. So if I double click here and I enter, so the way I'm entering is I'm not using the regular backspace, the enter underneath the backspace. You have to use the one on the num tab, or you can use your regular enter if you hold down control and hit enter at the same time. It's going to give you the same, but I like to use the one on the num tab, just if you wonder what my personal preference is. So I double click on this and I see like, okay, so I have these two things. Okay, so that's already stored inside Python's memory. If I delete this line right now, and if I delete this line right now, just to try and do that, and just continue like I'm tapping down, list is still defined as being these two things, and that'll last right up until I close my Maya, or if I redefine it. So if I go in and say my list is equal to hello and world, very standard stuff, right? That's the basic of every open tutorial. But right now I have a new list. So every time you create something, Python will give you something, and it will give you something and throw it back if it can. So in this case, we've only written command. And what I want to do now is I want to say my sear for my circle. And what happens if we delete our old circle here? I triple click on the line and I hit enter. Right. So I didn't actually get a result thrown back here, because if I double click on this word now, the information has been stored for me. And that's really powerful, because now I can start manipulating with this one. So if I say, okay, so I know I have my information about my circle saved here. We know that what it throws back to us is the transform node and our NURBS, which is basically our shape node, right? So what can we use those two things for? Well, we can either rename them, or we can name inside our command. So let's say that I want to name this like if I want to make, let's say that we make just a basic IK arm in this round. So if I say the name or my CTRLN, and I'm just gonna give it a random name, so let's call it L arm IK and then control. So you can go with whatever naming convention you want. So if I triple click on this line, so right now my control name has actually been saved or stored. So if I go in here in my circle, okay, so we have something in our commands, and in every command you have something called flags, and the way they work inside of Mel, as you can see here, you say dash and then you say C, so that must mean something. And we have a dash in R, and we have SW, we have R. So all these things mean specific things, and the way we can figure out what they mean inside the Python tab is that we can go onto the Maya documentation. So let's try and quickly do that. So if I double click on the name here and I hold down my right click and I say command documentation, let's try and go here. So whoopsie, it will actually open up my standard browser and tell me all the information I need to know about circle. And you can see up here we're in the Maya tech docs and we're in the command Python, and I'm underneath this circle. So basically I can throw in any command in here and it'll tell me the information in that command. So what is it that we want to do right now? Well, basically we want to make our command, but we want to name our circle at the same time. We want to call it our IK control. So let's try and go here and see what can we do. We can give it a name, so let's try and search for name. So if I control F and I say name, okay, so I get a couple of results. I get about 12, and we just keep on going down because we want to go down into where our flags are, and immediately as I go down you can see I get a command for flags. So common flags is N for name, or I can write name. So what does it do? It sets the name of the newly created node. Okay, that sounds pretty promising. So let's try and go back here and say, if I either write N, and in Python you write equals, and then we say CTRLN because we created that name up here. So let's delete the one we already had. Try and run this line first so we know that that's stored. And then we say control and we write name now. So you can see if I had been in Mel, I would have to write -N and then whatever name I had. So, oh sorry, like this. Like so. But in Python what we do is we write equal. So I'm just gonna go with this. So if I tap 3 times on this line and I say create that. Okay, so let's see what it actually threw back in my sphere. Okay, so I threw back my arm control is the first object inside my list, and my next object into my list is the shape node. So that's brilliant. So right now if I wanted to actually manipulate this object, I could either pick up I can either pick up my name or I can pick up my shape. So let's say that we want to just pick up the name. So I'm going to say commands.select, and we're just going to say select control name because we just selected that. So if I deselect outside in the Maya viewport here, I'm just going to say select control N, and boom, it selects my controller because that name is stored here. I can also access it in a different way. So let's try the other way. So right now I want to access only the first object inside my list, right? So how do you access one object inside a list? So we can say we have the circle, that's where our 2 names are stored, so we want to access one of them. So if I go in, I can either access both of them, which means that I'll be selecting both the shape node and the controller, and I don't really want to do that. I just want to select my control node. So if I say the first object in my list, so inside any programming or most programs, let's try and delete this one down there so it's confusing. delete that. So inside any program you can access, we know that this is a list, so I'm telling I want to access something in the list of that object, and I want to access the first object. And in a list in Python and in a lot of other programs, the first object would not be called 1, which is probably like what most people would logically think, but it's actually 0. So if I say select only the first object here, it still selects my only first one. And how do we know that that's the first one? We can also say print to these things. So if you want to make sure, so we can say print ctil and 0. And let's try and print that. Sorry, it gives us an error, so let's try and read these things. So module object has no attributes. Okay, so that's probably because we didn't call it ctrl, we called it cir. So if I go like that and say print, you can see now there's no square brackets around, which is important because now it's no longer a list, now it's just a regular object. So it's just a regular object that we have here. And this is what you call a string, which is just a combination of word. It can be any word, but as long as they're inside brackets, they'll be called strings. And you can have one string, or you can have more strings. So in a list, for instance, you can have both numbers and everything, but I don't want to go into detail about that. Just stick with me. So right now we created like two things here. We created a controller and we created the names for it. That's pretty important, but let's try and duplicate copy these things and start working inside the script editor instead, so we can start using the power of working externally and not inside of my script editor. So I'm just going to delete these things, and I'm just going to keep these two lines here. I'm going to cut them out and delete all this, and I still want to keep this open. And don't try and follow along yet, because you can follow along now, but there's some things that we still need to do in order to constantly be able to re-update our script. So right now what I want to do is going back into Sublime and paste these two things in. And I'm just going to tap them into my module here. So we already know that if I go, we don't need to go into Maya. I know that some of you might want to do that, but go into Maya and try and, if I enter this again, does it give me, like, doesn't it print anymore? So if I press Control S now and I deleted my print statement and I just create my arm, some of you will go in and try and you'll fail because you need to reload your script. So the first thing we need to do inside of Maya is go in here, and if we say, Maya still doesn't know that we actually redid some stuff to our script. So right now we also need to make sure that before we call our function again, we need to make sure that we are reloading our function. So if we say our module, so if we say, let's try and reload. So reload, and then reload ctil, because that's how we import it, right? So right now we're gonna just go here. So it results, there was no errors, so that's all good. And then we try and call it, because remember to save out your file. So I hit Control S there, and just gonna run all of this. So we have a problem here. And I'm just trying to let the errors come and come as natural as possible, so you guys can see how I fix this. So first of all, get used to reading errors. You're gonna get them 24/7, 365. It's totally common, and normally you would write like a big long line of code, and then you'll start debugging it afterwards. So in this global name commands is not defined. Okay, so what does that mean? Where does it call the error? So it says the error is on line 6 inside my module here. Okay, so it's inside this script, it's in this module, and it's on this line. So we're just slowly starting to learn how to read errors. Okay, so what is the error? Global name commands is not defined. Okay, so let's try and go in here. Okay, so that's basically because the Maya commands has to be imported. You remember that we imported Maya commands, and that has to be done inside every script you do as well. So let's try and write import Maya.cmds as cmds. Let's try and hit save on that, Control S, and then let's try and run it again. Oh, okay, so it actually created our circle, and it's named L arm control. So perfect. So that was really simple. Like, we just read an error, we added the commands module to our script, and we found out how we can add a definition. And in the next video we're gonna try and see how we can make this name a little bit more flexible, so our control creator doesn't only create a control that's only called larm.ik. We want to be able to call it a different name every time we call this. So this is the first part of understanding how we create our modules, and if you got this far, that's good. If you watch the whole thing and then go back and do it now, that's also very good, because then you kind of know what's coming and the errors as well. So yeah, try and replicate this, and then I'll see you in the next lecture.